Her name was Natalie Reed, and that night her own mother locked the door in front of her son as if the boy were a stranger who had come begging for mercy. The iron gate of Marigold Hall was still trembling after a gust of sea wind. Cold rain swept across the stone path, carrying the smell of salt, rotting leaves, and the damp breath of a winter tightening its grip around Cape May. Inside the old mansion, golden light spilled through the tall glass windows. Soft piano music floated between laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the voices of adults speaking in that polished, falsely polite tone. Natalie stood on the porch, one hand holding her coat tight against her chest, the other gripping Eli's hand. The 7-year-old boy shivered in his dark blue sweater, but he still hugged his drawing book tightly to his chest. On the cover were the crooked words he had written himself, the family history of the Hart Reed family. Eli had spent the entire week drawing this house, the beach behind it, the old magnolia tree in the front yard, and great-grandmother Evelyn with her silver hair, sitting by the window. Caleb stood behind the mother and son, his shoulders already wet from the rain. In his hands was a small wooden frame he had made himself, a gift he had planned to give Evelyn so she could place an old photograph of great-grandfather Hart inside it. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Caleb knew that look from Margaret, the look she had given him ever since the day Natalie brought him home to meet the family. It was not exactly hatred. It was worse. It was contempt. The door opened just wide enough to reveal Margaret Reed's face. She wore a wine-colored velvet dress, a pearl necklace around her throat, her hair pinned neatly like an advertisement for elegance. But there was no warmth in her eyes. "Natalie," she said softly, her voice so gentle it almost sounded kind. "This is a private legacy dinner for the family. Your name is not on the confirmation list." Natalie looked at her mother. It took her one breath to understand that this was not a mistake. "I confirmed last week," she said. "Grandma Evelyn invited me. She even told Eli to bring his little book." Margaret glanced down at Eli. The look lasted only a second, but it was enough for Natalie to see it. It was not affection. It was not regret. It was irritation. As if the child's presence had ruined her perfect arrangement. "Tonight is about the Reed family name," Margaret said. "I do not want unnecessary tension." Caleb shifted slightly forward. Natalie felt that he wanted to speak, wanted to ask why his wife and child were being left outside in the rain, but he stopped. Not because he was afraid of Margaret, because he knew Natalie had endured this family far longer than he had, and there were some doors where the person being pushed out had to decide for themselves whether they still wanted to knock. Eli lifted his head. "I just wanted to show great-grandma my book," he said, his voice so small it almost dissolved into the rain. Margaret did not take the book. She only pulled the door a little closer. "Evelyn is busy with guests." Another time. In the living room behind Margaret, Natalie saw her father, Philip, standing near the fireplace. He saw her. He clearly saw her. But he immediately turned his face away and lifted his glass to his lips, as if the wine in his hand mattered more than his daughter and grandson standing outside in the cold. Farther back, Dylan was laughing with a group of guests, his suit perfectly fitted, wearing the confidence of a man who had never paid the price for his own mistakes. Natalie suddenly understood. This was not a list error. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a decision. Eli tugged lightly on her hand. "Mom," he whispered. "Did I do something wrong?" The question pierced Natalie deeper than anything Margaret had ever said to her. A child did not understand property disputes, family honor, or toxic relationships wrapped in silk. He only knew that he had dressed nicely, brought a gift, and then been rejected. "No, sweetheart." Natalie bent down, her voice gentle, but her eyes never leaving her mother. "You did nothing wrong." Margaret heard her. Her lips pressed into a thin line. In her mind, Natalie was still the difficult daughter, the one who argued, the one who asked questions, the one who noticed the cracks the whole family tried to cover with fresh flowers and white tablecloths. Margaret was not afraid Natalie would ruin dinner. She was afraid Natalie would see something she was not supposed to see, because in the East Library of Marigold Hall, a walnut wooden box had disappeared. And in Natalie's coat pocket, beneath the rain-soaked fabric, was the sealed envelope Evelyn had sent to her privately 3 days earlier. Natalie had not opened it. She only knew that on the outside was her grandmother's trembling handwriting. "Bring this with you to dinner. Do not give it to anyone but me." Margaret did not know about it. Philip did not know. Dylan certainly did not know. They only looked at Natalie as if she were an extra person in the family photograph. They did not know that the woman standing outside that door was not just the overlooked daughter. She was the only person Evelyn trusted to protect the true history of the family. Margaret lowered her voice one last time. "Go home, Natalie." Then the door closed. The lock clicked into place with a dry, final sound. For one moment, the entire porch sank into silence. There was only the rain falling on the copper roof, the distant sound of waves, and Eli's trapped breath. Natalie did not knock. She did not beg. She did not call her father. She did not text Dylan. She only bent down, adjusted her son's scarf, then turned and walked down the steps. Caleb walked beside her, quietly shielding Eli from the wind with his own body. Behind them, Marigold Hall still glowed like an expensive Christmas card, but to Natalie, that house had just revealed its true face. And this time, she was no longer sure she wanted to be invited back in. Natalie did not cry as she walked down the slick stone steps. That worried Caleb more than tears would have. He knew his wife. When Natalie went silent, something inside her had usually broken very deep. The car was parked beneath the old magnolia trees at the end of the driveway. Sea wind pushed through the bare branches, driving the rain sideways against the windows. Eli walked between his parents, both hands still clutching the book against his chest. The edges of the pages had already curled slightly from the damp air. The boy did not ask any more questions. He only lowered his head and hurried across the small puddles, as if walking more slowly would make the laughter inside the house sound clearer. Caleb opened the back door and helped Eli into his seat. He fastened the seatbelt for him, then took a towel and gently wiped the raindrops from the boy's hair. Eli looked at him with red eyes. "Does Great-Grandma really not want to see my book?" Caleb froze. He was the kind of man who was used to fixing broken things with his hands. A leaking roof, a squeaking hinge, a rotting wooden floor. He always had a way. But in front of that question, he had no tool he could use. "That is not true," he said slowly. "Some adults are doing something very wrong. But that does not make your gift any less beautiful." Eli nodded, but he did not fully believe him. Children do not understand kind answers given in response to adult cruelty. They only remember the door that closed. Natalie got into the front seat. She placed both hands on the steering wheel and stared through the rain. Marigold Hall was still glowing behind them. From a distance, the mansion looked like a perfect family painting, with firelight, music, and well-dressed people speaking about tradition and honor. But Natalie had just seen the back of that painting. There was no family affection there. Only arrangement. Caleb sat down beside her. He did not ask if she was okay. That question was too small for this moment. He only placed his hand on Natalie's shoulder, lightly, as if telling her she did not have to keep looking strong alone. "Should I go back?" Caleb asked. "Just for 1 minute. I want them to look me in the face when they say our son does not belong there." Natalie closed her eyes. For one moment, she imagined Caleb walking back up to the porch, pounding on the door, forcing Philip to turn around, forcing Margaret to stop using that soft voice to cut people until they bled. But then she opened her eyes. "No," she said. "I do not want to ask for kindness from people who planned how to deny it." The car began to move. The tires crushed over the wet gravel, leaving the warm glow of Marigold Hall behind. As the iron gate closed behind them, Natalie felt an empty space open in her chest. It hurt, but it was also strangely light. She had spent too many years trying to prove that she was part of that family. When she was 18, she filled out her own scholarship applications because Philip said the family accounts were tight. That same summer, Dylan was sent to an expensive startup camp because Margaret said her son needed early exposure to the real world. When she was 23, Natalie worked late shifts in the university library, restoring old books until midnight so she could pay rent. Dylan dropped out of college, came home with a business plan he had not even finished writing, and Margaret threw a party because her son had finally found his passion. When Evelyn fell and broke her hip, Natalie was the one who drove her to physical therapy, arranged her medication, wrote down her follow-up appointments, and read old letters to her when the pain kept her awake. Dylan came once, took a photo with her, posted it online with the words "family is everything," then disappeared for months. And yet, at every dinner, Natalie was still the one called too intense, too sensitive, too difficult. Dylan was simply a young man learning how to grow up. Caleb had been pulled into that toxic order too. He once repaired the east porch of Marigold Hall after a major storm. He worked for days straight, his hands scratched until they bled. Philip thanked him with a nod. Margaret said in front of the guests that at least Caleb was useful when heavy work was needed. The whole room laughed softly. Natalie laughed awkwardly too. That night, she hated herself for that laugh. Now, looking at her son curled up in the back seat, she understood that her silence was no longer hurting only her. It was teaching Eli that being looked down on was the price of staying close to family. Not anymore. Inside Marigold Hall, Margaret stood behind the living room curtains, watching the lights of Natalie's car fade into the distance. She exhaled slowly and quietly. To her, Natalie leaving meant the dinner had been saved. No one would ask about the walnut wooden box in the library. No one would open Evelyn's old envelope. No one would break the story she had spent weeks building. But Dylan was not as calm as his mother. He stood beside the bar, his fingers tapping again and again against the side of his glass. Philip glanced at his son, then toward the hallway that led to the library. Both men knew one truth. If Natalie walked into that room, she would know immediately what had disappeared. And if she opened the envelope Evelyn had sent her, everything would stop being a family dinner. It would become evidence. Out on the road, Natalie's phone rang. The sound cut sharply through the car, slicing through the rain and Eli's quiet breathing. Grandma Evelyn's name appeared on the screen. Natalie stared at that name for a long time. One part of her wanted to let it ring out. Another part still remembered the wrinkled hand that had once taught her how to turn old letter pages without tearing the paper. Finally, she answered. Natalie. Evelyn's voice came through, low and cold. Your chair is empty. Who told you that you were not allowed inside my house? Natalie did not answer right away. She looked through the rearview mirror and saw Eli hugging his wet book to his chest. Then she spoke, each word clear. My mother. The other end of the line went silent. It was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of someone who had just heard a lock click open inside her mind. Then Evelyn spoke. Turn the car around. Bring Eli back here, right now. Natalie turned the car around in the middle of the wet, slippery coastal road. Caleb did not ask anything else. He only looked at his wife, then at Eli through the rearview mirror. The boy was still hugging his book to his chest, his eyes wide because he did not understand why they were going back to the place that had just pushed him outside. Mom, Eli asked softly, is great-grandma angry with me? No, Natalie said. This time, her voice no longer trembled. Great-grandma is waiting for you. When the car stopped in front of Marigold Hall, the main door was already open. Evelyn stood on the porch, leaning on her silver cane, a wool cloak wrapped around her shoulders. Rain blew into her hair, but she did not step back inside. She stood there as if the house itself had to fall silent behind her. The moment Eli stepped out, Evelyn bent down and wrapped her arms around him. It was not the kind of polite hug given in front of guests. It was the embrace of someone who was truly hurt because she knew a child had been wounded inside her own home. I am sorry I was not there to welcome you, she said, her wrinkled hand gently stroking Eli's back. Do you still have your book? Eli nodded and handed it to her. One corner of the cover was wet. Evelyn saw it, and her eyes darkened. She did not cry. A woman like Evelyn did not use tears when she was angry. She used silence. Natalie stood beside Caleb. She saw Margaret appear behind the door, her face turning pale for one very brief second before she immediately recovered her smile. But that smile was no longer perfect. It was pulled crooked by fear. Evelyn took Eli's hand, then walked into the dining room. The piano stopped first, then the conversation, then the sound of knives and forks being set down on plates. The entire room turned toward them. Natalie saw dark suits, silk dresses, half-finished glasses of red wine in the guests' hands. Everyone was so polite it felt cruel. No one asked why a child's hair was wet from standing outside in the rain. Evelyn tapped the tip of her cane lightly against the floor. Before we eat, she said, I need to correct a lie. Margaret stepped forward at once, her voice soft as velvet. "Mother, perhaps this was just a small misunderstanding. Natalie has always been sensitive about these things." Natalie heard those words, and another door opened in her memory. For years, every time she was insulted, Margaret called it sensitivity. Every time she noticed something wrong, they called her difficult. They did not need to prove that she was wrong. They only needed to make her look unreliable. Evelyn did not look at Natalie. She looked straight at Margaret. "Who told my granddaughter that her name was not on the guest list?" Margaret gave a strained smile. "I only thought the dinner would be too crowded. And Caleb, Eli, everything could become complicated." "Protect the family," Evelyn repeated slowly. She signaled to the event manager. The man walked to the sound table and played the recording from the front door camera. Margaret's voice filled the room, clear, cold, and without the slightest tremble. "This is a private legacy dinner. Your name is not on the confirmation list. Go home, Natalie." No one said anything. No one needed to. The truth had just stepped into the room by itself. Philip lowered his face. Dylan drained his glass in one swallow, but his hand was shaking. Natalie saw it clearly. Evelyn saw it too. She turned to Dylan. "If this is a legacy dinner, then bring out the walnut wooden box from the library. I want everyone to see great-grandfather Hart's pocket watch and the original deed to Marigold Hall." Dylan stood frozen. The dining room changed instantly. The air was no longer filled with embarrassment over a lie. It became fear. Margaret turned to Philip. Philip looked at Dylan. Their three gazes collided like people who had just heard a lock open on a room they thought had been sealed shut. Dylan swallowed. "I do not think we need to do that, Grandma. Old things are fragile. We can do it later." Evelyn took one more step. "I said bring it out." Philip hurried to interrupt. "Mother, I sent that box out for preservation inspection. I wanted to surprise you." Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and took out a neatly folded receipt. She placed it on the long table. The sound was very soft, but it made the entire room go cold. "Preservation at an Atlantic City pawnshop. Philip." Philip's face went white. Margaret gripped the back of a chair. Dylan cursed under his breath, but the room was far too quiet for anyone not to hear it. Evelyn continued. Her voice did not rise, but every word seemed to fall onto the stone floor. "The pocket watch, the silver seal, and 2 secondary land documents have all been pawned. Dylan signed under a representative authority he did not have. Philip knew. Margaret knew. And all of you sent Natalie away because she is the only person in this house who would immediately recognize that the box was no longer in the library." Natalie felt Caleb take her hand. He understood even before she fully did. All those years she had been called difficult, nitpicking, unreasonable. It was really because she remembered every document, every line of ink, every crack in the family objects. She was not a nuisance. She was the guardian. Margaret burst into tears. "Mother, I only wanted to protect the family from a scandal." "No," Evelyn said. "You wanted to protect Dylan from consequences, and you were willing to throw Natalie and her son out into the rain to hide a crime." Dylan slammed his glass down on the table. "Everything was going to be mine anyway. Natalie does not even live like a Reed. All she does is cling to old papers and judge everyone." This time, Natalie stepped forward. She did not raise her voice, but the entire room heard her. "You call them old papers. Grandma calls them history. A lawyer calls them evidence." Evelyn turned to her. In the old woman's eyes was something Natalie had never seen from her parents. Trust. Absolute trust. And that was when Evelyn revealed the final secret. The heir who manages Marigold Hall is not Dylan, not Margaret, not Philip. According to your grandfather's will, that right belongs to the person who has preserved this family's history throughout the years. That person is Natalie. The whole room held its breath. Natalie stood still. The woman who had been locked outside only a few minutes earlier, the woman who had been called troublesome, too sensitive, and not truly part of this place, had suddenly become the only person with real authority inside that house. Evelyn looked at Margaret, Philip, and Dylan. "Dinner is not over, but your performance is." Margaret was the first to break the silence. She looked at Evelyn as if she had just been betrayed by the very house she had always believed was a reward reserved for her son. "Mother, you cannot do this," she said, her voice rising, stripped of its usual velvet softness. Natalie does not know how to run Marigold Hall. She does not understand high society. She does not know how to protect the family's honor. Evelyn looked at her daughter for a long time. There was no anger left in her eyes, only a sorrow that had hardened through years of endurance. Family honor is not in white tablecloths, Margaret. It is in how you treat the person standing outside the door. Those words made Margaret take half a step back. Philip reached out to steady his wife, but even he could barely stand firm. For years, he had chosen silence because silence was easier than confrontation. He let Margaret speak for him, let Dylan make mistakes for him, let Natalie suffer for him. That night, his silence was no longer neutral. It was called by its true name: complicity. Dylan tried to laugh. A twisted, spoiled smile trembled at the corner of his mouth. "You are going to hand everything to her just because of a few old papers." Natalie looked at her younger brother. For the first time, she did not see the little boy their mother used to pull into her arms after every mistake. She saw a grown man who had lived too long on other people's money, other people's trust, and opportunities that had never belonged to him. "Not because of old papers," Evelyn said, "because Natalie understands the value of the things you were willing to sell." She turned to the event manager and asked him to call the family lawyer that very night. Not tomorrow morning, not after dinner, that very night. Her voice was so calm that no one dared to interrupt her. Philip whispered that this should be handled privately. Evelyn did not look at him. "You chose to do this in front of the family when you locked my granddaughter outside, so the truth will also walk in through the front door." Margaret burst into tears. But this time, her tears did not pull anyone closer. The guests who had once laughed with her, praised her flower arrangements, and admired her elegant velvet dress, now looked down at their napkins or turned their eyes away. There was less pity for her than discomfort. They had just watched a mother push her daughter and grandson out into the rain to hide her son's wrongdoing. Eli stood close beside Caleb. He did not understand all the words the adults were using, words like will, management rights, and forged documents, but he understood one thing. His great-grandmother had not abandoned him, his mother had done nothing wrong. And his wet little book was now lying on the main table, right in front of Evelyn, like something more precious than every silver glass in the room. Evelyn placed her hand on Natalie's shoulder. "From tonight on, you do not need to ask for a seat in this house anymore. You have always had one." Natalie heard those words and could not speak. Not because she wanted the property, not because she wanted to win, but because her whole life, she had stood on the edge of her own family's love, wondering how much more she had to do, how much longer she had to endure, how much better she had to become before she was finally seen. And in the end, the only person who truly saw her was the oldest woman in that house. Margaret and Philip left Marigold Hall before midnight. Dylan walked out last, his face red with anger and humiliation. When he stepped through the door, the rain had stopped, but the wind was still cold. Natalie watched them leave without feeling triumphant. She only felt another door inside her quietly close. This time she was not the one left outside. 1 year later, Marigold Hall no longer looked like a museum of lies. The heavy curtains Margaret loved had been taken down. Light poured into the East Library. Caleb restored the old bookshelves and built a long table where Natalie could preserve letters, photographs, and family records. Eli had a small corner near the window where he drew maps of Marigold Hall and wrote each person's name in his crooked handwriting. Evelyn still sat on the porch every afternoon, drinking tea and looking out at the sea. Sometimes, she called Eli over and asked him to tell her more about what he had drawn in his family history book. He would speak with excitement, like a child who had finally learned that his voice had a place where it could be heard. Margaret and Philip moved into a small apartment in the city. They told relatives that Natalie had stolen everything. Dylan was investigated for forged documents, and the debts that came out afterward were larger than anything Philip had ever admitted. Natalie heard those stories through other people. She did not call. She did not explain. She did not run after the version of the story being twisted by people who had grown used to bending the truth, because sometimes peace begins when you stop defending yourself. That Christmas Eve, Natalie stood in front of the fireplace, watching Eli asleep on the long sofa, while Caleb covered him with a blanket and Evelyn smiled beside a cold cup of tea. The house was not perfect. Her new family was not perfect either. But no one had to stand outside a door to prove they were worthy of being loved. If you have ever been overlooked by your own family, ever been called too sensitive simply because you saw the truth, remember this: some doors do not close to punish you. They close so you will stop knocking on the wrong house. And if Natalie's story made you think, leave a comment and tell us whether you would forgive or walk away in her situation. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and come back for the next story.